Okay, so today we're going way beyond just single sentences
Oh, yeah.
to look at a theory that tries to explain how we understand whole stretches of language.
Exactly. Like,
Yeah.
how do we actually make sense of a conversation or, reading a book?
Right, a whole text or even just like back and forth dialogue.
Right.
It's called Discourse Representation Theory, or DRT for short. And it was first introduced in the early 1980s
Mm-hmm.
by a guy named Hans Camp. And actually, a similar theory
Oh,
is being developed independently
at the same time?
around the same time
That's so interesting.
by Irene Heim.
Okay.
And for me, like thinking about this from a philosophical perspective, what's really interesting is how DRT shifts our whole view of meaning.
Yeah, absolutely.
It says it's not just about analyzing individual sentences in isolation.
Right.
It's about how we build up a mental model
Mm.
of the entire discourse
Yeah.
as it unfolds over time.
Yeah. And that's actually a big shift
Yeah.
from, more traditional formal semantics, like in the Montague tradition.
Right, exactly.
And I think what's really fascinating here is that DRT suggests this really kind of fundamental thing about how we process language.
Yeah.
It's not just, the meanings of individual words, strung together like beads on a string.
Mm-hmm.
It's this active process of constructing mental models as we're hearing a conversation or reading a text.
Right.
So it's a mentalist theory in the sense that it cares about, the mental processes
Mm-hmm.
going on. But it's also a representationalist theory
Okay.
because it says that those processes involve building and manipulating these internal representations.
Right. So we're literally building like a model of what's going on in our minds
Exactly.
based on what we're hearing. So what are these mental models?
So in DRT, they're called discourse representation structures,
Okay.
or DRSs for short.
Okay, DRs.
And they have two main components.
Okay.
First, you have these things called discourse reference.
Oh.
And you can think of them as kind of like mental placeholders
Yeah.
for the things that are being talked about in the discourse. So like, the people, the objects, concepts, whatever it is.
Right.
And then the second component is these DRS conditions,
Okay.
which are like the pieces of information or facts that we associate with those discourse reference.
So it's kind of like we're creating this mental database as we're listening or reading.
Yeah, exactly.
It's constantly being updated.
And the really cool thing is that DRT also gives us a way to describe those models formally, like a kind of syntax for DRSs, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And along with that, there's a model theoretic semantics that tells us how those representations actually relate to the world.
Okay.
And then on top of that, there's this, construction procedure that specifies how each new sentence we encounter kind of modifies and extends our existing DRS.
Right. So it's a formal system
Yeah.
for how we're understanding discourse.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you mentioned that this approach is really good for tackling certain puzzles in language,
Yeah.
especially this thing called anaphora. So from a philosophical standpoint, what makes anaphora so tricky?
So anaphora, at its heart, is about, how we link up linguistic expressions.
Okay.
Often pronouns with things that have already been mentioned, like
Yeah.
he, she, it, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
You might think that's super simple.
Yeah.
But certain kinds of anaphora actually reveal the limitations
Oh.
of our traditional kind of logical analyses
Mm.
of meaning and reference. And a classic example of this are these things called donkey pronouns.
Donkey pronoun.
Yeah.
That's a very catchy name.
It is.
What's the classic example?
So imagine these two sentences.
Okay.
If Pedro owns a donkey, he beats it.
Okay.
Or every farmer who owns a donkey beats it.
All right. So focus on the it in both of those.
Right.
What is that referring back to?
Yeah, so at first glance, it seems like it's referring back to a donkey in both cases. But here's the philosophical problem.
Uh-huh.
A donkey is what we call an indefinite noun phrase.
Okay.
It doesn't refer to some specific donkey that we've already picked out.
Right. Traditionally, pronouns were thought to either refer directly to a specific entity in the world
Mm-hmm.
or to be bound by a quantifier,
Okay.
like every or some. But there's a certain kind of syntactic dominance that needs to be there for a quantifier to bind a pronoun.
Okay.
And that's often described in terms of command.
Okay.
So like the quantifier is higher up
Yeah.
in the syntactic tree.
The hierarchy.
Right.
Okay.
So in these donkey sentences, a donkey doesn't really fit either of those roles.
Right.
It's not referring to a particular donkey like the donkey would.
Yeah.
And often it's also in a syntactic position where it can't properly bind the pronoun at it.
Yeah, it doesn't have that kick command.
Exactly.
But as speakers,
yeah.
we understand these sentences just fine.
Yeah, we totally do.
Like we know what they mean.
Exactly.
So the first one seems to imply that any donkey that Pedro owns, he beats.
Right.
And the second one seems to suggest that every farmer beats all of the donkeys that they own.
Yeah. And so there's this almost like universal
Yeah,
force.
there's this implicit kind of universal quantification.
Yeah, that a donkey is taking on.
Exactly. And that's exactly the problem that dynamic theories like DRT were developed to solve. They offer this more dynamic account of how meaning unfolds in a discourse,
Yeah.
to go beyond this referential or bound variable dichotomy.
Okay, so how does DRT and this idea of building mental models actually help us solve this puzzle?
So the key is in how DRT handles the introduction
Okay.
and then subsequent reference to these entities.
Mm-hmm.
So when we hear a sentence like a farmer chased a donkey,
Okay.
DRT says that we create two discourse reference in our mental model.
Okay.
One for the farmer, let's call it X,
Okay, X for the farmer.
and one for the donkey,
Mm-hmm.
a P for Y.
Okay, Y for the donkey.
And then we add these conditions to the DRS
Mm-hmm.
that specify that, X is a farmer, Y is a donkey, and that X chased Y.
Right, so it's like a little scenario that we're building up in our mind.
Exactly.
How do we then connect this mental scenario to the actual world?
Right, so that's where this idea of embedding functions comes in.
Okay.
They're kind of like mappings.
Okay.
From the discourse reference in our mental model
Mm-hmm.
to actual individuals in a particular situation.
Okay.
So a DRS is true if there's at least one way to map those discourse reference to real things that makes all the conditions hold.
So there has to be a way for our model to match up with reality.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so let's say we then encounter a sentence like, he caught it.
Okay.
What happens then?
So that sentence introduces what we call anaphoric discourse reference,
Okay.
which are kind of placeholders that need to find their counterparts
Mm-hmm.
in the existing mental model.
Okay.
So he might introduce a discourse reference we could call V,
Okay.
and it might introduce one we could call W, and we add the condition that V caught W.
Right. Okay.
But because this new information comes after the previous sentence,
Mm-hmm.
we try to relate those new discourse reference back to the old ones.
So this is where we figure out who he and it refer to in the story we're building up.
Exactly. So in this case, it's pretty simple.
Yeah.
We equate V with X the farmer and W with Y the donkey.
Mm-hmm.
So our updated DRS now says, X is a farmer, Y is a donkey, X chased Y, and X caught Y.
Okay. That handles that simple case.
Yeah.
But what about the more complex cases with negation or conditionals?
Right.
The things that were problems for the traditional logic. How does DRT's mental model approach handle those?
Yeah, so DRT can handle those by using what are called complex DRS,
Okay.
which can be embedded inside each other.
Okay.
So let's take the sentence. So Pedro doesn't own a donkey.
Okay.
So you might represent that with a main DRS that has a discourse referent for Pedro, let's call him Z,
Okay.
and then a negated embedded DRS inside of it.
Okay.
And that embedded DRS would contain a discourse referent for a donkey, let's call it Y,
Okay.
and the condition that Z owns Y. And the negation sign basically means that whatever's in that embedded DRS doesn't hold in the actual situation.
So the little world of the donkey is like blocked off by the negation,
Exactly.
which is why we can't then say it is gray, because there's no it that we can refer back to.
Right, except
Because it was in this negated space.
Exactly. And this is where this idea of accessibility becomes really crucial.
Okay.
Discourse reference that are introduced inside the scope of a negation
Okay.
are generally not accessible for later anaphoric reference.
Yeah.
Because they're not considered to be part of the scenario that we're actually building in our mind.
Right. So they're not part of the real story.
Exactly.
Okay. How about conditionals?
Right.
Like, if Pedro owns a donkey, he beats it.
So for conditionals, you would typically use an implication symbol
Okay.
connecting two DRSs.
Okay.
So you have the antecedent DRS, which is the if part.
Okay.
So Pedro owns a donkey.
Yeah.
And then the consequent DRS,
Mm-hmm.
which is the then part.
Okay.
So he beats it.
Okay.
And the pronouns in the consequent would be anaphoric discourse reference,
Right.
looking for their counterparts.
So I'm guessing that the key to that universal interpretation we were talking about has to do with how accessibility works in these conditional structures.
Exactly.
Okay.
So in DRT, the antecedent DRS of a conditional is accessible to the consequent DRS.
Okay.
So the pronouns in the then part can link back to the discourse reference that were introduced in the if part.
Okay.
And this combined with the way that implication works in the semantics,
Okay.
which basically says that whenever the antecedent is true, the consequent also has to be true.
Yeah.
That's what gives rise to that universal reading of the donkey sentences.
Okay.
It's as if the conditional sets up this hypothetical scenario,
Mm-hmm.
and then the things introduced in that scenario are available for reference within that hypothesis.
Right.
Right.
So it sounds like DRT treats indefinites like a donkey differently from actual quantifiers like every or.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Right.
Okay.
That's a really important distinction.
Yeah.
In DRT, indefinites aren't inherently quantifiers.
Okay.
Their main job is to introduce new discourse reference
Mm-hmm.
and the conditions that apply to them.
Okay.
They don't have any quantificational force on their own.
So the feeling that there exists a farmer and a donkey, in the sentence, a farmer chased a donkey,
Mm-hmm.
comes from the fact that those discourse reference are introduced in the main DRS.
Right.
And to make the whole thing true, there has to be at least one way to map those to real things.
Exactly. That existential force comes from the requirement that there has to be a verifying embedding for the whole DRS.
Okay.
Whereas in the antecedent of a conditional, the universal force comes from the logic of the conditional itself. It's saying what has to be true whenever the antecedent is true.
So the quantificational force is coming from the context, not from the indefinite itself.
Exactly.
So accessibility seems to be the key mechanism here.
Yeah.
Can we define it a little more formally?
Yeah, so accessibility in DRT is a relation between DRSs.
Okay.
It's transitive and reflexive. You can think of it like a scope of reference.
Mm-hmm.
So one DRS is accessible to another
Mm-hmm.
if it's embedded inside of it in certain ways.
Okay.
Like if it's inside a negation
Mm-hmm.
or a disjunction, or if it's the antecedent of an implication.
Okay.
And importantly, the antecedent of an implication is accessible to both the main DRS and the consequent DRS.
Okay.
And there are similar rules for, quantifiers.
Okay.
But the main point is that a pronoun represented by a discourse referent X in some DRS
Okay.
can only be linked to a discourse referent Y if Y was introduced in a DRS that's accessible from the first one.
Right. So it has to be in the right scope.
Exactly. It's got to be in scope. And this isn't just some random rule. It follows from how we interpret those complex DRS structures.
Mm-hmm.
And it explains how we can have anaphora across sentences,
Right.
and how in some cases the semantic dependencies override the syntactic requirements, like in those donkey sentences.
Okay, so it sounds like DRT is not just a theory of individual sentences, it's a theory of how we build meaning in an ongoing discourse.
Yeah.
Okay, so the source also mentions some extensions of these core ideas to things like tense, presupposition,
Right.
attitudes. Can you tell us a bit about those?
Yep.
How are those handled in a DRT kind of framework?
So researchers have extended the core ideas of DRT to try to tackle these other tricky linguistic phenomena.
Okay.
So for example, with tense,
Okay.
some DRT theories see a parallel between how pronouns refer back to entities
Mm-hmm.
and how tense can refer back to times or events that have already been established in the discourse.
Okay.
And this has led to investigations into things like donkey tense.
Donkey tense.
Yeah, which has some similarities to donkey pronouns.
Okay, so there are temporal versions of these puzzles.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. Okay, how about presuppositions?
So presuppositions are these background assumptions that come with certain words or grammatical structures.
Okay.
And the relationship between anaphora and presupposition has actually been a really fruitful area of research in DRT.
Okay.
So one prominent approach is the binding theory of presupposition,
Okay.
which basically suggests that, like anaphoric pronouns,
Okay.
presuppositions need to find antecedents or binders in the previous discourse.
Okay.
And if they can't find a suitable binder,
Mm-hmm.
then they might get accommodated,
Okay.
which means that the listener kind of implicitly accepts the presupposed information
Okay.
to make sense of what's being said.
So they kind of update their mental model.
Exactly.
You include this new information.
Right.
Okay. And how about attitudes?
Okay.
Things like belief and desire.
Right. So this is where DRT's focus on mental representations becomes really interesting.
Yeah.
Because traditional theories of, belief
Mm-hmm.
often run into this problem of logical omniscience,
Oh, yeah.
which is the idea that if you believe one thing,
Mm-hmm.
you must believe all of the things that follow logically from it.
Right, which doesn't seem very realistic.
Exactly.
Okay.
And DRT offers a way out of that by saying that the objects of belief
Mm-hmm.
are these structured representations,
Okay.
like DRSs or something similar.
Okay.
And differences in those representations can explain why you might believe one thing,
Yeah.
but not something else, even if they're logically equivalent.
So it allows for more fine-grained distinctions
Exactly.
in our beliefs.
And this has actually led to the development of mental state DRT,
Okay.
which uses ideas like internal and external anchors
Mm-hmm.
to handle these attitudes.
Okay.
So like beliefs or desires about specific individuals.
Okay, so it can represent not just that you believe something, but that you believe something about a particular thing.
Exactly.
Okay.
So that gets at this really kind of fine-grained structure of our mental states.
Okay, so our source also mentioned this thing called segmented DRT or SDRT. How does that relate to all of this?
So SDRT basically extends DRT
Mm-hmm.
by incorporating discourse structure
Okay.
and coherence relations.
Okay, what are coherence relations?
So coherence relations are like the connections between the different parts of a discourse.
Okay.
They explain how the sentences hang together.
Okay.
So things like elaboration, explanation, contrast, that sort of thing.
So SDRT is about how we build a story from the individual sentences
Yeah.
and how those connections influence what we understand.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And in SDRT, you have this thing called a discourse structure graph,
Okay.
where different segments of the discourse
Okay.
are represented by DRSs, and they're connected by these coherence relations.
Okay.
And these relations can then influence things like anaphora resolution,
Okay.
even beyond the basic accessibility constraints of DRT.
Right.
So, for example, a pronoun might be more likely to refer back to something introduced in a segment of discourse.
Mm-hmm.
That has a particular coherence relation to the current segment.
Okay.
And one example of this is the right frontier constraint in SDRT.
Okay, so adds this layer of pragmatics on top of the semantics. Okay, so the last part of our source dives into some philosophical debates
Yeah.
about the representational nature of DRT and the implications for compositionality.
Right.
So can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so the fact that DRT uses these mental representations
Mm-hmm.
as a kind of intermediaries between language and the world has been a topic of a lot of discussion.
Right.
Some people think we should try to develop more direct theories of meaning
Okay.
that don't rely on these representations.
So no mental models.
Right. So they might say that linguistic expressions directly refer to things in the world,
Okay.
or that they directly update some kind of context,
Okay.
like in dynamic predicate logic, for instance.
So the question is whether we need that level of mental representation
Right.
to have a good theory of meaning,
Exactly.
or if we can do it without.
Right.
So how have those non-representational theories fared?
So those non-representational theories have been really successful at accounting for a lot of the things that DRT can account for.
Okay.
But interestingly,
Yeah.
even those theories often end up using some kind of representational tools.
Oh.
So like variable assignments,
Okay.
which are mappings from variables to individuals.
Okay.
So it raises the question of whether any dynamic theory can really be truly non-representational.
Okay.
Right,
So what about compositionality?
right.
The source mentions that DRT isn't really compositional in the strict sense.
Right, so compositionality is this idea
Yeah.
that the meaning of a complex expression is determined by the meaning of its parts
Mm-hmm.
and how they're combined.
Right.
But the way DRT handles anaphora,
Okay.
where you introduce a discourse referent and then later connect it to something else,
Yeah.
that's not really compositional in the strict sense.
Okay.
Because the meaning of the pronoun doesn't tell you anything about its antecedent.
Right.
So there are compositional versions of DRT, but they tend to handle anaphora resolution as a separate module.
Okay.
So the debate about how important compositionality is and whether it's really necessary,
Yeah.
that's still very much an open question in the field.
Okay. So these debates about representation and compositionality really touch on some fundamental questions about meaning.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the fact that even those non-representational theories often need to use some kind of representation,
Yeah.
that suggests that maybe representation plays a more fundamental role in meaning than we might have thought.
Right.
So it's something for philosophers to really grapple with.
So to sum up this deep dive into DRT,
Yeah.
it gives us this really interesting way to model how we understand discourse.
Yeah.
It's not just about the meanings of individual words or sentences.
Right.
It's about building up this mental representation of what's being said.
Exactly.
And the notion of accessibility really helps to explain how anaphora works.
Yeah.
Even in these really tricky cases. And the extensions to tense presupposition and attitudes,
Right.
show how powerful this framework is for thinking about all sorts of complex phenomena in language.
Right.
And I think it has a lot of interesting implications,
Mhm.
not just for linguistics,
Right.
but also for philosophy of language and philosophy of mind.
Exactly.
So for our listeners out there, think about how this idea of language understanding
Yeah.
as this active process of building mental models
Hmm.
connects to your broader philosophical views about mind, meaning, and communication.
Yeah, absolutely. And one really provocative thought is that if even those non-representational theories need to use some kind of representation,
Yeah,
what does that tell us about how we actually grasp meaning?
right,
Is a purely direct theory of meaning even possible?
right.
Or do we always need some kind of internal representation?
Yeah, that's a great question to think about.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.